German Jewish studies, wrote famous books on, or impactful books on hysterical men during the First World War, and on most recently on Jewish department stores in Germany, and is working now on Austrian department store, one story. Austrian immigrants and so on. So we collaborate a lot in exile studies, German Jewish studies, and in general. And so it's my pleasure to hand over the microphone to him.
Yeah, why don't you come up now? Yeah, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Wolf, and for the kind introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here. I was here for 4 papers yesterday, and I just thought they were excellent, each one of them, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to be here for more of the conference, but this is how it is when the conference comes to you, and you have to balance things like teaching and seeing students and all that other stuff. But I'm here now, and I'm delighted to join you, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Hasia, who I actually introduced in this very room, what was that, 3 years ago? Something like that, for a Casden Institute event, a Casden conversation about her wonderful book, which I'm about to tell you about. So she's the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, where she's director of the Goldstein-Goren Center. She received her PhD at the University of Illinois Chicago and her MA at the University of Chicago. A specialist in American Jewish and immigration history, she's the author of numerous books in these fields. Of particular relevance, she is the author of The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000, which was published by the University of California, and We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After World War II. Among others, she's held a Fulbright Fellowship and a Guggenheim, and she's a member of the American Academy of Jewish Research and the Society of American Historians. And what I also neglected to tell you is that this panel is entitled Reactions in Jewish Communities, and we'll be hearing from Hasia about the American case, and her paper is called 1938, A Moment of Reckoning for American Jews. So please join me in welcoming Hasia.
Okay, how's that? Is that the right angle? Okay, so you will notice I'm not having any PowerPoint, and there are going to be no images, so you'll have to look at me. And I also am really not going to be reading a text, because I thought that was that was what we were supposed to do. At a few moments, at a few points in this talk, I will, however, just look down so I can read a quote. Dorothy Zelig, an author of some note, published a book called A History of Jewish Life in Modern Times for Young People in 1938, published by Block Publishing Company, one of the signature houses for American Jewish books. This volume, which was intended for middle school, high school age students, there was no way that it could do anything other than tell its story in a decidedly very somber tone, which was quite unusual for this genre of writing. That is, most books written for Jewish young people had tried to tell a positive story about why be Jewish, what is the value of Judaism and Jewish life. But in her chapter called The Story of the Jews in Germany, she took a very ominous tone. At present, she declared, under the Hitler rule, anti-Semitism has reached such a high point that the future of the Jews in Germany seems very gloomy. She advised the teachers in her Things to Do and Talk About section of the chapter that the children in the Jewish school role play Jewish life in today's Germany, suggesting that they create a classroom drama to imagine and enact, quote, Elsa's house before she leaves Nazi Germany for the United States, conveying to these American Jewish youngsters the stark reality that Elsa and her family could not remain at home. She, Zelig, however, also adopted a tone that resonated throughout nearly all the words and deeds of American Jewry as it faced their kin in Europe and as it surveyed the crisis unfolding there. Zelig, in this 1938 book, wrote, quote, Jews have gone through difficult periods before. they will not lose hope now. So I see this as a reasonable springboard for my talk, which asks how the Jews of the United States, about 5 million or so people, some of whose words we have access to, particularly the leadership, manifested in their words and deeds a sense of deep kinship and commitment to the Jews who lived under Nazi rule, and how these Jews of the United States experienced vicariously from afar the process of delegitimization, dehumanization, and violence which was being visited upon their people. How did they, from the relative security, and in my notes I have the word relative underlined, okay, meaning that it wasn't necessarily so clearly unambiguous, from the relative safety from across the ocean, how did they respond to the events there? How did they define their responsibility? And how do they define their ability to effect change, render assistance, provide relief? What constraints operated upon them? And what did they understand was in their capabilities? Now, it's pretty obvious, and maybe I don't need to say it, but I will anyhow, that they had absolutely no idea, thinking, let's say, about the Anschluss and the Vienna pogroms, and then the occupation of the annexation of the Sudetenland, and then culminating in Kristallnacht. They had no idea where this was going to lead to. They had no idea what their own fate might be, because 1938 was indeed a pretty gloomy year among American Jews. It was, we might think of this as the kind of height of influence, or at least outreach, of Father Coughlin and a number of other pretty nasty anti-Semitic demagogues who not only articulated Nazi-like rhetoric, but also invoked the triumph of Hitler as something that they would like to model in the United States as well. So these Jews had no idea what was waiting for them or awaiting the Jews of Europe. And they also had absolutely no way of knowing that if they had what they could do, what would be effective. And we as historians also cannot ask, or we can ask, but we certainly can't answer, if they had done more, would that have actually made a difference? If they had done it differently, would that have made a difference? Now, there are many ways to attack this analytic challenge, and so I've chosen to look at two particular responses of American Jewry in this period, but again, suffice it to say there are many other ways to look at this, and I think they should all be tried by a scholar. So first, I want to note the efforts by American Jews, the leaders in particular, to recruit non-Jews of goodwill to speak for and with them. The efforts of these Jewish leaders to publicize the words, activities, responses of their non-Jewish allies in support of the Jews of Germany. In essence, throughout this period, with again 1938 as a particularly heightened moment in time, although it continued well beyond 1938, they made the effort to say, we are not alone, we have friends. This is probably was probably a very psychologically very important strategy, but it was also a very political one, in-as-much as the effort to recruit non-Jews of goodwill to work with them allowed them to show to the larger American public and to the government in particular that it wasn't just Jews who cared about these matters, that it wasn't just Jews who felt this sense that the Jews of Europe were in peril, and that any actions on the part of the United States government should be understood as not just a Jewish matter, but as an American or as a human matter. So there is so much that one could draw from to try to illustrate this point, and so I'm going to limit myself in this these few minutes I have to looking at very superficially kind of low-hanging fruit, which is the American Jewish Yearbook, a volume published every year starting in 1898 by originally the Jewish Publication Society, and then it was adopted by the American Jewish Committee, and it was a very intense and dense survey of the events of the year involving Jews of the United States and of the world. And suffice it to say here that while it wasn't the kind of book one curled up with on one's couch for light reading, it was a book that was sent to all government officials, to members of Congress, to governors, to mayors. It was in libraries, and it might be thought of as the official, in quotes, compendium of kind of Jewish reactions to the events of whatever the year was. So looking at the volumes of 1938, 37, 38, and then 38, 39, one can see that not only was the situation of the Jews in Germany prime in their consciousness, at the forefront of their concerns, but both years had a section called Movements for Better Understanding. And in one of those two volumes, they wrote, appraising the influence of the forces of ill will and the anti-Jewish agitation promoted by them, readers, however, should recognize, quote, the forces of goodwill are much more numerous and active, and the wholesome intergroup attitudes generated by them are much more in harmony with the American spirit than the heresy of intergroup hostility. These 2 years, the yearbook chronicled, offering pages and pages and pages, lists of meetings, publications, petitions, articles, sermons, radio broadcasts, films, various film projects, as well as testimonies made in city councils, state legislatures, the halls of Congress by non-Jewish upholders of American support for the Jewish crisis at both home and abroad. It listed books of the year authored by non-Jews, which documented the hideous actions taken against the Jews of Germany. And so again, in the 3738 volume, it listed John Haynes, Holmes, Dorothy Thompson, William Harmon Black, whose books Through Gentile Eyes, Refugees, Anarchy or Organization, and If I Were a Jew, among many, many others, which highlighted the dire circumstances of the Jews in Europe. The yearbook drew attention to the authors as a group, for example, like Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes, who squarely stood with the Jews and declared that he was a Gentile who considered it his responsibility to make his plea for tolerance and goodwill. This kind of action typified much of the non-Jewish, this kind of reportage typified much of the non-Jewish action during these crisis years, as the American Jewish Yearbook reported it. American Jews, notables, organizational heads, communal figures, turned to their Catholic and Protestant colleagues to write on behalf of the Jews, to speak at rallies, and indeed to form organizations and committees to advocate for the Jews abroad in distress. These same political acts undertaken by Jews alone, the Jewish leadership calculated, would have smacked of Jewish special pleading, and therefore would have played into the hands of the critics of the Jews, who long argued that Jews cared only for themselves and had too much power. But when articulated by a Catholic priest or a Protestant minister or a Protestant an American of Protestant background, these calls of concern and advocacy for policy change appear to be humanitarian and selfless. Okay, so this genre, again, the idea of having non-Jews speak for the Jews, and then publicizing the acts and the words and the deeds of non-Jewish supporters was a very powerful part of the arsenal marshaled by American Jewish leadership in the years, the months leading up to Kristallnacht, and then I can tell you beyond that as well. But by no means did American Jews sit back and wait for non-Jews to speak for them, which leads to my second point that I want to make in the context of this talk, is that in the years, again, particularly with 38 as a turning point, they understood the need to act, to restructure and reorganize Jewish communal life in order to be able to take steps which would effectuate more sustained action. They were very concerned about fostering greater Jewish unity within America, to erase ideological differences, to work together in order to collectively do something for the Jews of Europe. So that horrible year of 1938 saw a number of significant changes in the way in which American Jews did their communal work. Okay, again, we could ask how much difference it made, but they didn't know that. They didn't know it would make perhaps very little difference, but they thought that each one of these steps was a potential response that could do something for the situation. So, for example, in 1938, the American Jewish Committee, for the first time in its history, hired a public relations specialist. Okay, they hired Richard Rothschild of the Walter Thompson and then the Lord and Thomas advertising agencies to organize and supervise a broad coalition of Jewish and non-Jewish opponents to Nazism and to anti-Semitism. Through this arm of the American Jewish Committee, Rothschild generated a steady stream of propaganda materials using every genre at his command to deliver the message to the American people that anti-Semitism was wrong, that the Jews in Germany stood at the brink of disaster, and that it was incumbent upon the United States to act as it could. Okay, excuse me, we just want to unclip people. Okay. Okay. So many of the changes that were made within the context of organized or disorganized American Jewish life, and that was certainly one of the issues, is it was always quite disorganized, were issues or were strategies that had been thought of before. These were things they were talking about in the teens, in the 20s, earlier in the 30s, but it was 1938 that allowed this movement from thinking about unity to actually coming up with some ideas about it. So in some cases, Jewish agencies reorganized or redefined their organizational structure right before and then after Kristallnacht to be able to respond quickly and effectively to the rapid-fire events of Europe. The Joint Distribution Committee, conscious of in the face of 1938 and of what it called an emergency of huge proportion, jettisoned familiar fundraising structures and disbursement of monies, and came up with a new strategy to be able to, quote, render assistance without delay. It needed a new structure. It became less driven by a handful of wealthy and well-placed individuals. From the perspective of ideological, and there are, by the way, many others like this, and I'm going to really only hit on a few of these changes made in this period. From the perspective of ideological change, which registered in 1938 and immediately before and after, the decision of the Reform Movement Central Conference of American Rabbis in late 1937 to, however gingerly, alter its position on Zionism generated much attention. At its meeting in Columbus, Ohio, the CCAR announced that it, for the first time in its history, looked positively on the idea of a Jewish homeland, the upbuilding of a Jewish homeland for the rehabilitation of Palestine, a reversal of a stance that it had taken at the end in the 1880s vis-a-vis a Jewish homeland. The change clearly reflected the greater sympathy of the organization towards the Jews caught in the Nazi onslaught. So too, Jewish women's organizations like National Council of Jewish Women, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, the Women's League of the United Synagogue of America, the Women's Branch of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, which until late 1937 had been publicly identified with and signed onto the agenda of the American peace movement, severed their relationship with the various peace organizations, realizing in the face of 1938 that pacifism was not the answer to the problem. That ability or willingness first manifested in 1938 among American Jews to cooperate along previously profound ideological and organizational differences also led to some notable local and national innovations. Probably the one that is most significant was that in January 1939, so a month and a half after Kristallnacht, the United Palestine Appeal, the fundraising body of the Zionists, along with the Joint Distribution Committee, which had always been non-Zionist, quite cool to the Zionist project, and the National Coordinating Committee Fund, which had been formed in 1935 to address the needs of German Jewish refugees who had made it to American shore, banded together to create nothing less than the United Jewish Appeal. Its formal title was the United Jewish Appeal for Refugee and Overseas Needs. The fissures in the past, which had made it impossible for these organizations to work together, were, although they were constantly swiping at each other and constantly in conflict, it made it possible for them to go on, to band together, to raise money, which over the next few years became the kind of juggernaut of fundraising. And it's no exaggeration to say that nearly every penny used to fund the flight of Jews out of Nazi-dominated countries to resettle them in places of refuge on nearly every continent, to provide food and supplies, and by smuggling and subterfuge to the Jews still in Europe before and during the dreadful years of the war, came from the United Jewish Appeal, again, an organization forged in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of Kristallnacht. In 1938, within 2 weeks of Kristallnacht, the B'nai B'rith, for the first time, it was the first time an American Jewish organization had opened a national office in Washington. Okay, so until then, there had been no Jewish presence in the national capital. In 1938, after Kristallnacht, the B'nai B'rith opened an office. We might just also add on a local level, in the local level, in a number of important Jewish communities around the country, because of Kristallnacht and the refugee influx, Jewish community councils were formed. These were representative bodies, some of which there were some from earlier in the 20th century, but these councils were efforts to have a single Jewish voice in Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Newark, and so on the crucial issues of the day. These community councils, again, always riven by differences between different factions, between the wealthy and the not so wealthy, between Jews of different ideological persuasions, however, managed over the course of those late 1930s years and into the war years to be able to work together. So I'm going to draw this to a close, and I already got my 5-minute warning, and I believe in following the rules. These individuals within the formal apparatus of American Jewish life had no idea if their decisions would actually go anyplace, if they would actually make a difference, if they would lead to positive changes in the grim reality. We cannot know, likewise, what they accomplished, if what they accomplished could actually be attributed to those horrible days of November 1938. But we do know that these Jews of the United States, as manifested in their publications, in their communal activities, in the vast panoply of words, and in the unceaseless activities that they took on, believed that they had no choice but to do these things. They didn't have any choice, and as I had thought about this, the image that came to my mind is that little Dutch story of the boy who put his thumb in the dike. He wanted to save his people. This was the only thing that he had at his command was his thumb. He did it. It clearly made no difference in the long run because the deluge came, but yet when we survey this moment in time as the Jews of the United States faced 1938, what becomes more manifest or what should become manifest in our understanding is the degree to which they defined this as what they had to do, and they did it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hasia. That was a fascinating paper, and I think I'm very sympathetic to the move to focus less on the results of sort of Jewish organizing or the effectiveness of Jewish organizing than the impact of it on the kind of subsequent development of the American Jewish community. And if I may, just briefly, a quick question before we open the floor. I'm wondering, in light of some of the discussions yesterday morning, how in this publication, the American Jewish Yearbook, and in other sources you've looked at how what term they use for Kristallnacht, and how they describe the event, and how they frame it, do you want this?
Yes. Yeah, so it's a great question. So one of the interesting things about the yearbook, although it's really just one of almost infinite number of sources, is it actually redacted much from the Jewish communal press, both English and Yiddish, and so that the words they used were to some degree reflective of what publications they were redacting, and so they used the word pogrom, they used the word terror, they used the word organized violence. The word Kristallnacht, I don't remember seeing that word particularly, but it was a description of what happened. And from their point of view, it was very clear this was organized by the state. Okay, this was not a kind of random mob action that just sort of boiled over, but the state, that is the Nazi regime, was the responsible party.
I will demonstrate my ignorance here about American Jewish history, but I wonder whether this was a point where different backgrounds of American Jewish traditions would come together, or whether this was something which had already happened, or whether you can distinguish between more typically German Jewish forms of mobilization and Eastern European Jewish forms of mobilization, and whether there was some sort of coordination or parallel tracks in mobilization.
Okay, so on the one hand, the differences which had been so manifested earlier were in fact shrinking. By 1930, a majority of the Jews of the United States were born in the United States. So if their parents had come from Lithuania, or their parents had come from Hungary or from Germany, over time came to mean less and less. And even the change in the stance of the reform movement vis-a-vis Zionism has to be kept in the context that a majority of the rabbis who were members of the Central Conference of American Rabbis were from East European Jewish homes. They were American-born young men of East European homes, primarily Lithuanian, so that in fact those differences from the past were shrinking, and as the children of the East Europeans, of the more recent immigrants, were rising economically, those kinds of differences mattered less, but there still were significant differences. And so in these bodies, like the United Jewish Appeal at the top, or the community councils, in the city of Baltimore or Washington, D.C., still had tensions, and there would be literally screaming matches over what should we do and what was the appropriate response. And the leadership, its goal was to try to dampen these divisions in order to have a sort of united front. And so there were other attempts at unity, and then the American Jewish Committee would say, well, we're not going to join it. Okay, or another case, the B'nai B'rith said, we're not going to join it. And then some peacemaker attempted to bring them in. So the sense was unity was important, but different groups staked their class, ideological, sort of integrity on not participating and trying to take over. So it's not that this was all so harmonious, okay, but the desideratum was unity.
Was there any city that you studied where the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee actually agreed and cooperated over time?
So the question is, does over time mean like months, years?
Let's say in the wake of 38.
Yeah, so both organizations belonged on the local level to the community, again, the local community council. And so when an issue would come in front of the council, what stance should we take on, whatever the issue, they would disagree, but then the council would issue a single statement that represented some kind of consensus. So yes, they did find ways to work together, not always, but it was not an unheard of reality.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting paper. I was thinking, can you maybe go a little back in time to the 1933 and look a little bit in a comparative way? Because you kind of described it in a way, there was a lot of kind of ununity or disunity, and then it kind of got better because of 1938. But in 1933, I saw that there are these demonstrations, there are these collective collections of money efforts. So is there maybe already some organization and it gets worse again and then it gets up again?
Well, I'd say that cooperation was always there are moments of cooperation even back. So for example, the founding of the Joint, in 1914 was an example of an ability at that moment in time to come together for what's the name? What is the origins of that name? The Joint. It was the Joint. It was the Landsmannschaften, the Orthodox congregations, the American Jewish Committee, and the Zionists, who said the crisis of the Jews of Palestine and Central Europe because of the war is so great that we have to act jointly. Now again, they were constantly riven in their meetings and in their one-on-one interactions, but yet when one might use the very technical term, when push came to shove, they were able to collect money together. So 1933, you have the boycott movement, and the American Jewish Congress and the Jewish Labor Committee. The Jewish Labor Committee is a little later, but there, the American Jewish Congress and the Jewish war veterans were very out front on the boycott issue. The American Jewish Committee was opposed to that. Now they weren't opposed to it because they thought Nazi Germany was going to be okay, but they thought it was a bad strategy. So again, in this moment of time, the idea of unity is an elusive goal, but that on some matters they were able to come together. I think the thing that really was provided that focus was fundraising. let me say has been historically the great strength, or in the 20th century, is that they could get together to raise money for the UJA and continue on this, into the post-war period.
You never thought about where the name came from.
All right, so.
Are there other questions for Hasia?
I'm just wondering.
Oh, yeah.
The representation of
Wait.
You mentioned sort of like the necessity of, unless I'm totally messing up the talks and they're merging. You mentioned the advocacy, for, against the Kristallnacht events by, let's say Catholic or Lutherans, right?
Protestants.
And so which sort of like become a kind of like, PR, non-Jewish PR campaign in the public sphere. Now, can we sort of like, so how do you see, at what point does this taper off, the necessity to feel one needs to have a non-Jewish spokesperson to represent, Jewish issue to an American public, right? And how does it square with the fundraising efforts, right? I mean, and at what point does one no longer need a spokesperson, or is that something that continues to persist?
Okay, that's great. So one thing, it predates the Nazi period. In other words, you can see examples well back into the latter part of the 19th century that American Jews turned to non-Jews to work with them to solve one problem or another. And on the other hand, I would say it never ends. I mean, this was a constant human relations strategy of American Jewish organizations that working in the logic that as a group, and they represent, 3% of the American population, maybe 4%, that anything they're going to argue for in their own name, as the only ones arguing for it, will never have that kind of traction, will have the traction that they need. And so they're constantly involved in outreach. I mean, we can see this into the 1960s and 1970s, and probably is going on now as we speak, so that they never see it as over, and it was a very important part of these meetings and these gatherings to be able to say it's not just us, but this is a violation of American norms, and we have behind us. It isn't just this little 4% of the American population, but it's the Catholics, it's the Protestants. They too are joining with us in this effort. So after World War II, they again are involved in creating organizations pushing for assistance to displaced persons. So Jews don't do it alone, and they always look for non-Jews to work with them.
What was the response like when they would ask Protestant and Catholic clergy to join in?
I mean, usually very positive. I mean, I think I may end up being, like the Pollyanna of American Jewish history, but it's very striking how they get people to work with them on these causes. And again, there are moments when they part company, and we can look at phenomena in this period and later periods where the Jews will take a separate stand. Often to the chagrin of their partners. But there are very few examples of getting rebuffed. And so in one of these yearbooks, they make a very big point of giving a lot of attention to the fact, after Italy passes the racial laws, that they were able to convince this major Italian-American newspaper publisher, Generoso Pope, whose newspaper, by the way, was paid for by the fascist government, got him to come out and condemn the racial laws. And so, now, did it matter? Did Mussolini really care that Generoso Pope said, this is against my view of myself as an Italian? But the fact is they did it, and that's for a group of people who have no political power. Okay, I mean they have no kind of independent clout. This was a very significant political strategy.
So we have a little more time. First, Mary Filbrook, and then Steve.
Yeah, that was fascinating. You've presented it, though, very much as Jews reaching out to other groups like Catholics, Protestants, so on. One of the things that struck me again and again and again, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this, is the involvement of Quakers. When you read testimonials, memoirs, accounts of being helped to get out of Buchenwald in the wake of Kristallnacht, for example, the American Friends Service Committee and Quakers more generally seem incredibly proactive, and I wondered whether they fostered actively links with the people that you've been looking at, or whether they work together, or whether this is just yet another kind of intervention.
Right. I mean, I think that's really interesting, and I think the relationship between American Jews and Quakers would be really fascinating because they work together in a number of capacities, but usually they show up in a kind of string. You know, it's like a paragraph that will have the names of, 75 religious communities. Okay, and they are the Quakers there. So they're definitely part of this. But I think one of the really striking things about, kind of the American religious landscape, it was so multi-denominational. And it's, in fact, kind of meaningless to say Protestant because there were so many Protestant churches, so many, I think, dozens of different kinds of Lutheran synods, so that they're in a way kind of playing this entire field and looking for as many names to put in that string. And so if it was just the Quakers, okay, it's just the Quakers, but what becomes the power of even that paragraph in the American Jewish Yearbook was the fact that the paragraph listed one group after another, after another, after another, or one publication after another, and in a sense the larger impact was we have them all.
So we're running out of time, but I'm going to give Steve the last word because then we need to...
All right, well, I'll give a comment that will lead into the next paper, which is in 1933, it's much more problematic than you're presenting it in 38. The American Jewish Committee, that is the outreach of Jews to religious groups. In 1933, I guess March, April, you have a major division between the American Jewish Committee, or let's say the American Jewish Congress, really led by Stephen Wise, who's saying we have to be aggressive. Hitler is a bully. And the only way you can deal with a bully is to get in the face of a bully. And that's why they were a very aggressive organization. They combined with Samuel Untermeyer, they launched the boycott, whereas the American Jewish Committee, led by Judge Proskauer, is arguing that if you get in Hitler's face, he's going to double down and make it worse for the Jews. And that's why we've got to go through back channel religious leaders in Germany and get them to represent our cause. And it would only be much later that division gets a little less contentious.
Okay, a little less contentious because it's, in a sense, they come to it with a very different kind of idea of what's the appropriate strategy. But in a sense, the goal is the same, and the question is, how do you get there? And so I think one could emphasize the fact that the committee and the Congress are always sniping, but there are the moments when they're able to work together. And I think that becomes very much the leitmotif of 1938 and beyond.
Okay, thank you so much, Hasia. Okay, and now it's my great pleasure to bring up my colleague, Steve Ross, who, I don't know if this has been mentioned yet, but Steve, you have an op-ed in the LA Times today, don't you? Sunday, okay. Just had an op-ed in the LA Times providing, I think, crucial historical background to some of what we're seeing going on around us these days in this country. I think you probably are all familiar with Steve Ross by now, but I'm going to introduce him nevertheless. He's professor of history here at USC, and he's also director of the Casden Institute, as I think you know. His most recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was selected as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History for 2018. It was also on the LA Times bestseller list for 12 weeks. His previous book, Hollywood Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics, received the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Film Scholars Award and was selected by the New York Times Book Review as a recommended summer reading for 2012. His op-eds have appeared in the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, Hollywood Reporter, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, and Politico. He's lectured throughout the US and internationally in such places as Paris, London, Sydney, and Auckland. So Steve's talk today is entitled The Ambiguous Legacy of Kristallnacht, Nazis, Resistors, and Anti-Semitism in 1930s through 40s Los Angeles.
All right. I don't want to give a paper, I want to tell you a story. And I want to tell you a story about Kristallnacht that you've not heard before. And I want to suggest in this story the most dramatic and consequential responses to Kristallnacht did not come in the public sphere, did not come from government authorities, but rather it occurred in the hidden realm of ground-level actions taken by Nazis and by resistors. The idea that, at least before I started writing this book, I had believed the conventional wisdom that after Kristallnacht, it changed American opinion about Nazi Germany. And I would suggest it didn't matter. Not a great deal. And the initial response, as several of us have said already in the last 2 days, is Franklin Roosevelt denounced the pogroms. He recalls the ambassador. He also recalls his U.S. commercial attaché, Douglas Miller, and he demands that the Hitler regime pay compensation to the damages done to Jewish property and businesses. But despite these verbal condemnations, the American government does nothing. It does nothing to stop German territorial aggression or the persecution of Jews throughout Europe. And this tepid response by the American government was matched by a very ambivalent response by the American public. Sure, the figure everyone quotes is the Gallup poll says 94% of Americans disapproved of the treatment of Jews. Well, the statistics you may not have heard is that while Americans are condemning anti-Semitism abroad, they remain much more equivocal about Jews at home. Another Roper poll showed only 39% believe Jews should be treated like everyone else. 53% of Americans believe Jews were different and should be restricted. And 10% of Americans believed all Jews should be deported. Well, Kristallnacht did have an impact on the United States, but not in the way we would think. Nazi aggression abroad was matched by Nazi aggression within the United States. And indeed, in Los Angeles, the members of the German-American Bund were emboldened by Hitler's relentless march across Europe. And many of you, particularly those of you coming from abroad, think of you're in LA, you're in Hollywood, this is Jewish land. This is what Los Angeles looks like in the 30s and 40s. Everything in red is either a Nazi or fascist group. And as I told some of the people on the walking tour Sunday, I could not fit all the fascist groups on the map. Otherwise, downtown would have been one red blur. You have only one blue spot, don't you? Imagine being a Jew in LA in the 1930s, and some of you were downtown, walked by Broadway. That's what you would see. You would walk down Broadway, and there was swastika flags flying very unproblematically. Well, on November 16th, local Bund leader Hermann Schwinn, let me go back for a minute, Hermann Schwinn addressed an excited crowd who came to Deutsche Haus to celebrate Kristallnacht. Deutsche Haus being on right here, right by your hotel is Figueroa, and if you go up about 1.5 miles, you would hit Deutsche Haus at Figueroa and 15th. It's now a parking lot for the convention center. Well, Hermann Schwinn steps to the podium surrounded by stormtroopers dressed in full uniform, and he blames Jews for causing all the damages and the massacres in Germany. And he tells the crowd that American Christians were finally waking up to the Jewish menace, and he predicted, quote, "Within 5 years, we will see Jews dangling from telephone posts and trees." Our conference focuses on Kristallnacht, but it's a mistake. We need to see Kristallnacht as part of a series of events. If you want to understand the American response, we need to see it in the context of the Anschluss in March 38, then the capitulation of Western leaders at Munich in September, the siege of the Sudetenland in October, and finally Kristallnacht. In wake of these events, and in wake of the utter capitulation and cowardness of Western leaders, Hitler's minions in Los Angeles began working actively towards their Tag, the day that Nazis and their supporters would seize control of the American government, either through the ballot or through the bullet. Once in power, they promised their adherents that they would eliminate the two greatest dangers facing America, communism and Judaism. Well, Angelenos did voice their anger at Kristallnacht with a series of highly publicized anti-Nazi meetings. On November 18th, here you have one in August 1938, and you had another one in front of the German consulate in September. But in November, which I don't have a picture, November 18th, several days after Kristallnacht, 3,500 local residents flocked to Philharmonic Auditorium for a quarantine Hitler rally where they heard actor John Garfield and director Frank Capra condemn Germany. 10 days later, 1,000 men and women turned out for a similar mass protest at the Grace Methodist Church, organized by Jewish and Protestant clergy, as well as the leaders of the United Anti-Nazi Conference. Well, I would suggest these meetings had no impact on Hermann Schwinn and the German-American Bund and their American fascist allies. Anti-Nazi protesters believed that words and rhetoric could be effective weapons. Schwinn believed that guns and well-drilled troops would prove far more effective in attaining his vision of a Jew-free America. 3 weeks after Kristallnacht, Stormtrooper leader Mike Dre read a 21-page set of secret orders that had come to Los Angeles from Bund headquarters in New York City, instructing local members to begin rigorous training in firearms and hand-to-hand combat. And over the next several months, stormtroopers in Los Angeles held shooting practice on a regular basis, sometimes on the second floor of Deutsche House, where they set up a pistol range, but more often they would go out into the Hollywood Hills, or they would go where we're going to be going tomorrow, in the Palisades, where they were building Hitler's Western White House, a 22-room compound that would serve as his headquarters after he conquered America. Well, in fact, as Schwinn's Lieutenant Reinhold Kutsch quipped after receiving the orders, quote, "It looks like we're in the army now." Well, raising and training a well-drilled military force was only part of Hermann Schwinn's strategy for bringing National Socialism to the United States. To take over the American government, whether by force or consent, he needed to build a cadre of dedicated citizens who would support his vision of an Aryan nation. And following Kristallnacht, he began creating a network of secret cells, each no more than 10 people, that would be spread across the country. And this was modeled on Hitler's cells in the 1920s. Meetings were held in secret, and no cell knew about the existence of any other cell. Within a month of Kristallnacht, they had organized 18 cells in LA and anticipated more. Schwinn and Deibel also began organizing what they called private discussion groups in the homes of sympathetic Americans who supported the Nazis but didn't want that support known publicly. So while Bund meetings were attracting regularly 200, 300, 400, and their big rallies 2,000 to 3,000, Schwinn knew he needed to get supporters into the tens of thousands. By early 1939, he succeeded in organizing 100 discussion groups throughout Los Angeles and nearby Pasadena and Glendale. And much to the Bund's delight, these were not simply the low miscasts, the unemployed, the refuse of society. These included many of the society leaders whose names you could find in the LA social column. People such as Beverly Hills socialite Mrs. Preston Harris Fisher, who recruited like-minded people from the very exclusive women's club. Schwinn also gained popular supporters by hosting the German Radio Hour, a weekly program of news and music featuring National Socialist songs that could be heard every Friday night and Sunday morning. Well, we also want to talk about the unintended consequences of Kristallnacht in the United States. And here I would suggest that once again the vapid response of the American government led Germany to step up its spying activities along the Pacific coast. Nazis discovered they could funnel in money, propaganda, and secret agents very easily through the unguarded ports of Los Angeles. And by the end of 1938, Berlin was sending an unprecedented number of well-trained spies to assess the American nation's readiness for war and to scope out military installations and defense plants all along the Pacific coast. Well, Hermann Schwinn knew that he also had to forge a broad coalition of similarly minded organizations if he wanted to convince Americans to join his cause. And with Hitler's forces seemingly invincible in Europe, Schwinn found it very easy to assemble a consortium of anti-Semites prepared to take militant action against the city's Jews. And the group, which he called the United Front, contained Silver Shirts, who were the American fascists, Ku Klux Klan, Japanese fascists, Italian fascists, Mexican gold shirts, and white Russians. The Nazi cohort in Los Angeles by early 1939 was growing far more dangerous, and yet local and federal authorities proved totally complacent, preferring instead to focus their energies on keeping alleged communists under surveillance. With over 750 Nazi and fascist groups operating in the United States in 1939, and all of them cooperating with the Bund, Schwinn's vision of establishing a Jew-free nation did not seem so far-fetched. The problem is his confidence was misplaced. The eventual Nazi defeat in Los Angeles would not come from public protests. They would not come because of government action. Rather, Schwinn and his cohort would be brought down by a small group of men and women led by an individual the Nazis referred to as the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. In August 1933, several days after Nazis held their first open meeting in Los Angeles under the guise of the Friends of New Germany, Jewish attorney, World War I veteran, and founding executive secretary of the Anti-Defamation League, Leon Lewis, approached 4 members of the Disabled American Veterans and asked them and their wives to go undercover and join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles and to send him back daily reports of their activities. And indeed, often rising to positions of leadership, those spies kept Leon Lewis abreast of every single plot the Nazis were planning. And indeed, it's a good thing they did. Plans existed, his spies, but between 1933 and just 1941, they uncovered a murder plot to blow up the homes of 24 Hollywood actors and power figures, people like Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, Charlie Chaplin, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, for driving through Boyle Heights, which is the Jewish neighborhood here, with machine guns, machine gunning to death as many Jews as they could, for creating a phony fumigation company that would pump cyanide into the homes of Jews. And finally, they uncovered a series of plots to blow up defense installations and seize munitions from National Guard armories on the day Nazis planned to launch their American putsch. Well, in the months after Kristallnacht, Leon Lewis recruited an associate spy master, Joe Roos, an Austrian-born newsman turned Hollywood story writer, and the two of them began fighting local Nazis on two fronts: an expanded undercover operation and a more open public relations campaign aimed at alerting Americans to the growing threat Nazism posed to America. And as news of Nazi militancy, both at home and abroad, increased, they expanded the scope of the operation to place 3 new undercover operatives inside Nazi headquarters at Deutschhaus. They also recruited a series of trusted informants who sent them reports about potential sabotage at military installations and inside the city's aircraft factories. LA was the largest manufacturing center of aircraft in the United States. Lewis and Roos also collected information they received from their spies and sent detailed reports of what they learned to the FBI, to Army intelligence, and naval intelligence. Now, until Kristallnacht, Lewis's work had been confined largely to the secret world of espionage. But after Kristallnacht, things changed. Roos, the newspaper man, took a page from Joseph Goebbels, the man he considered, quote, the most clever, ablest propaganda agent in the world, and began his own propaganda campaign by, gosh, I got so absorbed in this, I forgot to show you some pictures. We have Hermann Schwinn. They dressed in full uniform a good deal of the time. That's him outside of Deutschhaus. And after the Anschluss, this is occurring 17 miles northeast of where we're sitting now in Hindenburg Park, which was owned by the German-American Bund. Hans Deibel taking people out for target practice. We have Leon Lewis, his 4 spies, all of whom had been military veterans. Joe Roos and his uncle Julius Klein. They launched the first spy operation in the United States in Chicago in 1931, spying on Germans returning, or Germans and German Americans coming back from Deutschland. This is one of the agents he placed inside of Deutschhaus, who became Hermann Schwinn's right-hand man, William Bachhacker. Now we're caught up. Roos's newsletter. Roos would take his spy reports and rewrite them as though they were detective spy stories, making sure that there would be nothing in the reports that would give away the identity of his secret agents. And he sent them to government agencies, but more importantly, he sent them to news outlets like Walter Winchell and the team of Robert Allen and Drew Pearson. With the FBI dragging its feet, and with the police and sheriff paying literally no attention to the Nazis, because when Leon Lewis went in to tell them what was going on, he was thrown out both by the sheriff and the police chief, and the police chief lectured him, saying, "You don't understand, Hitler's only doing what he needs to do to save Germany from the Jews, and that the real threat in Los Angeles are not Nazis and fascists, the real threat are all those communists in Boyle Heights." Well, the way in which they decided they would undermine the Nazi cause is by getting Hermann Schwinn's citizenship revoked. And indeed, they discovered there was a discrepancy in his forms. He had made a mistake of saying when he was in LA, and it was 3 months off. But simple mistake or not, armed with evidence from Leon Lewis and Joe Roos, the federal government eventually withdrew his citizenship. Instead of preparing for their Tag, Schwinn now had to prepare a court case to stay in this country. Well, they kept sending in for, yes, I see, I got my own here. The greatest legacy, I'm skipping now, of Kristallnacht would come on December 8th, 1941, when local FBI agents arrested hundreds of suspected German, Italian, and Japanese spies and fifth columnists. And they were praised. And in fact, if you go on the FBI website, you can get an account of every city, hour by hour, of who's arrested. And it's very impressive, except for one thing. When I asked for Herman Schwinn's Freedom of Information Act file, it began in 1942. J. Edgar Hoover did not order Schwinn to be put under surveillance until 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, and even then he ordered the FBI to send a local agent to Washington, D.C. for training. So how did the FBI know who to arrest? Because starting in September 1939, Roos and Lewis kept sending the FBI, Army intelligence, and Navy intelligence a list of all dangerous and suspicious Nazis, fascists, and fifth columnists. They divided them into 3 groups: dangerous, very dangerous, dangerous, and keep under surveillance. The FBI simply retyped those lists and called them List A, B, and C, and sent it out to their local agency on December 8th to arrest them. Well, let me conclude. I'm running at the 20 minutes. The full history of American Jewish response to Kristallnacht remains to be told. As the story of Leon Lewis and Joe Roos suggests, American Jews were far more active in opposing Nazism and fascism in the 1930s than we thought. And indeed, much of the scholarship about American reaction to Hitler is focused on the responses of national groups, such as the groups that Hasia was talking about both before. But the Los Angeles story suggests that American Jews were often highly successful in resisting Nazism at the ground level, far more so than American governments. And without ever firing a weapon, these 2 Jewish leaders managed to keep Los Angeles and its citizens safe. They and the men and women who risked their lives to spy on Nazis and fascists and understood that when a government fails to stem the rise of extremists bent on violence, it was up to every citizen to protect the lives of every other American, no matter their race, religion, or ethnicity. And the men and women, all of whom, all his spies, save for one, were Christians, but they never thought they were protecting Jews. They believed they were protecting Americans. If scholars are to raise questions about passivity and cowardice, the proper focus should not be on the nation's Jews, but on asking why did patriotic government authorities in so many cities turn a blind eye to Nazi activities in their own backyards. And given the events at Pittsburgh and the lack of any significant response by the current American government, the answers to these questions are as important today as they were 80 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really interesting to hear this paper in connection with Hasia's paper and to think about the different perspectives and the different conclusions the 2 of you reach. And I also think I've been familiar with the project that led to Hitler in LA for quite a while, but it feels very different hearing about it right now, especially maybe after Pittsburgh and on an election day that I know has some of us preoccupied. I'm sorry for that little momentary lapse on my part, but I saw that polls were closing. So I wonder how, if this isn't going too far, for a quick question as we start the Q&A section with you, how the work has felt to you, how it's felt to you seeing the reemergence of this stuff on such a dramatic scale as you've been working on this project and the book and the things that have grown out of it.
I started this project long before Donald Trump, but once he got into the fray, As people say, how long did it take you to write this? And I tell them, for me, it was 6 years, which is lightning speed. My other books are 9 to 11 years. But I've never felt so driven, and I've never felt the need to talk about passivity, that it just became clearer and clearer to me that we are in the same situation as we were in the 1930s, in the sense that we have a government that does not stand up for the rights of certain peoples, for the rights of minorities, whether it's Muslims, Jews, African Americans, and that it really is about citizen action. I mean, it really, conservatives love to quote the founding fathers. As my wife says, if you really want to make a lot of money, write a book about one of the founding fathers. But they are used as though they are conservative tropes. But just remember, it's Thomas Jefferson who says every generation needs to water the tree of liberty with their own blood. And I'm not calling for violence at all, and I'm not a fan of Antifa. But again, the point I made at the end is just imagine Leon Lewis had 3 spies who died because the Nazis swore that if they found you were working for the government, they would beat you to hell, but they wouldn't kill you. But if they found you were a spy working for the Jews, you would be dead. And 3 of the spies die. So this is a very dangerous thing to go and run any kind of spy operation. But on the other hand, he defeated a whole range of foes without ever picking up a gun. He used the most powerful weapon of all, which is the brain. And that's why I don't think it's about necessarily getting violent. It is about rising up and letting people in this country know we don't stand for this. This is our country. It's not Donald Trump's country.
The floor is open. Stephanie and then Hasia. Can we get a microphone?
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, which I enjoyed just as much as a walking tour. And I'm sorry if I know about the tension today in this country, but I would like to, my question goes back to 80 years ago. And I think one cannot stress enough the meaning of anti-communism in the 1930s, which explains why, I mean, to many in the US, also in Great Britain, it was not decided yet whether Nazism or communism is the lesser evil. And so there was a tendency to think that maybe Nazism is a lesser evil as compared to Stalinism at that same time. And if you look at the Spanish Civil War that went on just in parallel to Kristallnacht and all the other events that we're talking about, the position of the official US position and the British position was very clear. They were letting the fascist powers have have free hand against a Republican democratic government. So I think in order to understand why, as you said, why there was a kind of appeal in certain elite circles in Los Angeles, these Nazi circles, which seem so, I don't know, out of place, here, it has to do with anti-communism. And anti-communism was there in some states even before the communists were there,
Yeah, I would agree. But anti-communism, you can't talk about anti-communism without talking about anti-Semitism. And that's why. Because in the end, Nazis and fascists were good Christians. They were even though they weren't really necessarily good Christians, but the word was they were God-fearing good Christians, where we know communists were Jews. And those Jews, of course, the irony, of course, those Jews are trying to destroy capitalism, bring down capitalism. The Third International Comintern announces as its goal the destruction of worldwide capitalism. But who are the worldwide capitalists who control the media, who control the newspapers, who control the banks? It's the Jewish conspiracy. So the Jews are screwed either which way you go. They either control the world's finances and media, or they're trying to control the destruction of the world's finance, media, and democracy. But anti-Semitism, and just remember, again, when we talk about the response to Kristallnacht in America, in July 1941, we're talking almost 2 years into the war, 79% of Americans want nothing to do with anything going on in Europe.
So I think, because there are a lot of questions, let's do it German style and collect, and Hasia's next, and
So first, I just want to say I don't think our papers were so far apart. We're just looking at different.
No, we're looking at different aspects.
And the fact is that both of them say American Jews weren't passively sitting by and saying it's somebody else's problem, because they defined it as their problem. Secondly, I want to draw your attention to Warren Grover's book called Nazis in Newark.
Yes.
Because it's in some ways, obviously in a less glitchy place than Los Angeles. It's a very similar kind of story of a couple Jews and a couple, white, middle-class, liberal Quakers, Unitarians, who hired Jewish thugs to go and break up Nazi rallies, and armed with baseball bats. But my question, though, has to do with the pathetic, minimal U.S. government response. But perhaps my dates are off. But HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, was convened not to fight communism, but
fascism and Nazism.
With Samuel Dickstein, a Jewish congressman, as the first chair. And so how does that at least give us some little, sort of peek that the government wasn't completely oblivious to the fascist threat?
Dickstein is calling for the, oh, sorry, right.
Yeah, let's collect it to Jean-Marc Kreiss in the back, and then the gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. So I have two questions. So first one is, when will you lead the walk to downtown Los Angeles again? Because I want to do it. And second, I was a bit surprised, in many presentations in yours, that the violence against Jewish shops, mostly Jewish shops, outside Germany were not mentioned in the 1930s. It happened in London, it happened in France many times, it happened in many Western European countries. So in this, the tension you very nicely described, that were played also outside Germany, it went very often to physical violence towards shops, identified shop. Did it happen in Los Angeles, where Jewish shops smashed, robbed, by these neo-Nazis?
Let's take one more. Do you still have a question? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this was very new to me. 750 groups, cells, and so on and so forth, all over the United States. Sounds like a lot, but if you calculate like an average of 30 people in each one, you get at some 20,000 out of 100 million. Could you comment on the dimensions of that Nazi movement, and eventually also like what kind of backing did it have in? I mean, that's I believe at that time 1/3 of all Americans would claim that they would have German ancestors.
Can I actually just follow up? So, can we assume that the ethnic German community had, for the most part, gone along and supported the Nazis? In other words, what's the role of German immigration in basically rallying the Nazi cause abroad, right? Also going back to your question, because it strikes me there seems to be potentially a clear link.
All right, let me start going backwards then. Start with your question. Germans in Los Angeles were divided. The older Germans, first of all, the largest ethnic group in Los Angeles are Germans. There are 150,000 of them in the 1930s. They are the largest group by far, German Americans. The older Germans, many of whom had lived through World War I and found it very difficult to be a German and felt they had finally reestablished their community as a respectable American German community. They, at the very early days, they tried to keep silent, but then they opposed Hitler when the younger Germans, there were many different German associations within the city, and they began breaking apart between young Germans who were militant on behalf of Hitler and the Nazi cause, and older Germans who were appalled by what was going on. So there really was a major split in the German community. Of the 750 groups and dimensions, part of my answer would be, as I write in the book, that two of the major plots, one in 1935, which was going to be to kidnap and hang 20 Jewish leaders in Los Angeles, to bring them out to a deserted park, to have machine guns, to shoot their bodies as they were dangling from the ropes dying. They would shoot the bodies with so much lead that they would split the trunk in half and the trunk would fall on the ground. And they would tip off reporters, and reporters would come and find 20 Jews severed in half with the top trunk hanging from a tree and the bottom on the ground. And the man who designed the whole plot, Ingram Hughes, believed that what this would do would be to empower anti-Semites throughout the country to rise up and to have pogroms in every major American city. And the second plot, which I mentioned briefly, the 24 Hollywood leaders, 22 Jews, and 2 actors who were known to be too friendly to Jews, Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, who, if those of you don't know, spoke fluent Yiddish, having worked for Jews earlier in his life. It was the same thing. They believed that when word got out that Nazis could kill the most famous man in the world, Chaplin, and the most famous movie executives, that too would launch pogroms throughout the United States. So they believed it wasn't the number of people that mattered, it was the actions that they took. As for the question on the violence, we didn't have any in Los Angeles after Kristallnacht. There was no beatings, there was no breaking up of the stores. None of that occurred in this city, at least none that I'm aware of. And I read through the press for pretty much this whole period. And then Hasia's question about Dickstein and UAC showing concern, that Congress shows concern. Yeah, well, Dickstein, Lower East Side, one of the few Jewish congressmen, starts in 1933 wanting a House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate Nazis and fascists. But he's hated in the Congress. They don't like him. He's very disliked. And the only way he's able to get this through is he agrees that they'll add communists to it, that they'll look at Nazis, fascists, and communists. And in the first hearings start in various cities around the country in the summer of 1934. And I went through the House Un-American Activities records in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. And what I found is, first of all, HUAC appointed the most incompetent agents possible. There's some funny stories, but I don't want to run out of time. And in the middle of the investigation, once the HUAC was approved, Dickstein went to the House leader and said, there's no way I can lead this committee because no one in America will believe a Jew who's leading a committee investigating Nazis and fascists. And so they appointed McCormick from Boston, I forget his first name, John McCormick. And in the middle of the summer, John McCormick, after several weeks in which the spies are investigating both Nazi groups, American fascists, and communists, McCormick sends each of the investigators a note directly, not to the congressman in charge of the local investigation, but directly to the agent saying, stop all investigations of Nazis and fascists, only investigate communists now. And when you look at the entire body of HUAC the first year, in all the cities, 75% of all their investigation and all their reports have to do with communists, and 25% have to do with fascists and Nazis.
So let's take just a couple more in a kind of final round. Marla's next, and then... Yes, it's on its way.
So we're talking a lot about American support for fascists and Nazis and responses to this, and I think we have to really distinguish between American support for fascists, which begins in 1922, and it really goes from the center, maybe even a little bit center-left to the far right, that there's just very widespread support for Mussolini, really through the late 30s. That's very different than support for the Nazis, I think. And then also the anti-communism question is a really important point. And again, the distinction for supporters of Italian fascism, anti-communism is not that linked to anti-Semitism until the sort of post-invasion of Ethiopia, that it really is kind of anti-communism, anti-socialism, and Mussolini as the savior of Italy from the far left.
Yeah. The microphone is on its way.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. It was nothing less than an eye-opener, your presentation. I thought I knew something about California history, but obviously there's a lot I don't. But I wonder if you would comment on the weak response, as you so well outlined it, to the threat of fascism, German fascists and so on, and the robust response around that same time to the entire Japanese American community in California. And yeah.
You mean after Pearl Harbor?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. I think this is all we have time for.
Okay. Well, for the American support, in the U.S., I would argue, it was different in Europe, but in the U.S., I would suggest that anti-communism and anti-Semitism were linked right from the start, certainly from the 1920s. Many of the anti-communist groups, like the American Defense League and others that I've studied, were anti-Semitic, right beginning. The two were intertwined. In Italy, I believe it was different, that fascism was not, that you actually had Jews supporting fascism very early on. You don't have that here, at least not that I'm aware of.
Well, the Italian-American community reflected.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know as much about, because you don't have a large Italian-American community here in Los Angeles. And the fascists in Los Angeles tend to belong to the Silver Shirts. There is an Italian fascist organization here, but it's very small, and it aligns with the Silver Shirts in this city. The anti-Japanese activity, a lot of the response to that, I believe, I'm not an expert in this, but some of the response is that people are able to buy their property and buy all kinds of their businesses, their homes for literally pennies on the dollar. And they create General DeWitt, who's in charge of the Western United States, creates such a hysteria that we do intern some Germans, but very few, whereas we intern all the Japanese, including American-born Japanese in Los Angeles. And that's part of, I would also say, simply a racist response. It's the yellow terror. We have the red terror, the yellow terror, and the Jewish terror all going on. And I'm not sure which is the greater terror at which point in time.
Okay, please join me in thanking Steve. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker for the day, Gershon Greenberg. He's currently visiting professor in the Department of Jewish Thought at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he teaches graduate seminars and undergraduate classes on Musar, Hasidism, and Messianism during the catastrophe. And he is professor of philosophy and religion at American University in Washington, D.C. He received his doctorate from the Joint Program in Religious Philosophy at Columbia and Union Theological Seminary in 1969. And his primary research field is Jewish religious thought through the Holocaust. I'm just going to, excuse me, among his works are Wrestling with God, Jewish Theological Responses to the Holocaust, Oxford, 2007 with Stephen Katz, and he served as a fellow at Yad Vashem's Institute for Advanced Holocaust Scholarship and Hebrew University's Institute for Advanced Study, as well as the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. And I want to make sure I get the details right. Your plenary address from Lessons and Legacies was just published, and that's from the 2014 Lessons and Legacies? Yes, exactly. On theological responses to the Shoah. And his paper this afternoon is Orthodox Jewish Religious Responses to Kristallnacht, Globally Considered.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to be straight. I don't think my paper has anything to do with the other two. It deals with Orthodox Judaism, first of all, and it is on a reflective level. And I said this when I did the plenary address. I need to ask the audience to be open to a world to which probably you've had no access until now. It's a land unknown to most. And I also have a request that after I communicate to you what I have to say, if you could ask some questions on anything, any detail, any level of thought that you would like. And that would provide the opportunity for me to communicate with you into this, about this unknown world, but yet it is the world of about 2/3 of the victims of the Holocaust, namely observant, what we call Orthodox Jews. So here we go. Real-time reflective, Orthodox reflective responses to Kristallnacht, globally considered. Kristallnacht took place within and as an encounter between Nazi perpetrators and the Jewish so-called victims. Study of the real-time Orthodox Jewish response can help to apprehend that area between. The endeavor, however, comes with an epistemological stumbling block. The written sources belong to a sanctity-permeated universe, a realm whose sacraments, myth, ritual, institution were largely obliterated, making it nearly impossible for scholarly research to retrieve their in-themselves meaning. Nevertheless, research can position one at the threshold of that realm to look in the direction of its disappearance and perhaps catch a glimpse of that sacramental universe. Orthodox reactions to Kristallnacht were engaged with meta-history, a term initiated by Jakob Rosenheim and Isaac Breuer in the interwar years. Namely, starting with biblical scripture and the dialectical relationship between God and Israel's history, temporal and spatial events were raised to a spiritual realm and expressed in terms of a revelatory, mythic, dramatic narrative, which became a threshold for the metaphysical reality of redemption. Over the course of Israel's millennia of experience, as historical experience defied natural and rational comprehension, metahistory provided a refuge for traditional religious thinkers. In turn, this opened a path for Judaism to endure on a spiritual level, and perhaps, given the blend between the physical and spiritual for many Jews, on the physical as well. By contrast, when it came to the catastrophic events of the Holocaust, the reform and conservative branches of Judaism confined themselves to the data of empirical history and remained committed to universal humanistic values, oblivious to the meta-historical path. For example, during the first Sabbath after Kristallnacht, Parashat Chaye Sarah, on Sarah, Reform Rabbi Ferdinand Isserman of St. Louis preached, if need be, perhaps by the wounds and stripes of Jews in Germany and Austria, the suffering and woes of all mankind will be healed. The Jews of the past knew how to suffer with dignity. The Jews of the present will know how to suffer with equal dignity. As over against this, also on the same Shabbat Chaye Sarah, Rabbi Tobias Geffen of Atlanta, Georgia, thinking meta-historically, sublated the 400 million Reichsmark fine imposed on Jews for the destruction into the scriptural narrative of the 400 shekels which Abraham had to pay for Sarah's plot when Ephron reneged on his offer to give it. Hitler, Geffen predicted, would end up like Ephron, a leper isolated from mankind. The Orthodox rabbis, writers, predominantly rabbis, responding to Kristallnacht, who are spread across Eastern Europe, the land of Israel, and the U.S., Hasidic, religious nationalists, Torah-based, that's the revealed scriptural tradition of Judaism, Torah-based, streamed, identified with the Agudat Israel rabbinical organization, shared a common framework of reference, making it possible to distill their thoughts into cohesive patterns and to identify exceptions. Three basic themes may be discerned. One, the authors did not expect the calamity, especially, they said, because it emerged out of what they considered to be enlightened German culture. They also considered it to be unprecedented. It was also inexplicable in terms of human nature and rationality. But, having taken place within the universe created by God, it could be explained in terms of revelatory, divinely rooted mythic narrative sources, that is to say, meta-history. 2, insofar as God's special people, the Jews, were positioned at the sacred axis mundi of humankind, they were the prime movers of world events. In the minds of our writers, the Jews were the subjects and the nations surrounding them were the objects. Jews were not victims, but generators of events. Specifically, our thinkers believed that Jews who assimilated and abandoned Torah were responsible for Kristallnacht. They were an efficient cause while the final cause was God, in the sense that God intervened and punished the Jews indiscriminately with Amalek, that's a paradigm of evil, Amalek-like human instruments, so they would return to Torah. Suffering would then end. 3, the Troubles remained so daunting, so boundless, that they could only lead to an apocalyptic, transcending battle between good and evil, as an ontological duality which set aside any ambiguities regarding God's role in history. The battle would end with the onset of redemptive reality, which would balance out the destruction and keep the universe under God. So now, the three themes. Theme 1, the threshold to revelation. The cruelties of Kristallnacht, as over against the enlightenment of the modern world, directed the Admor of Bobov, Poland, Ben-Zion Halberstam, to look beyond natural behavior and reason. He issued a statement on 3 January 1939, 100,000 copies were reportedly distributed, that a torrent of fury, where Jews were expelled and left with nothing, where righteous fathers and sons and innocent weanlings were slaughtered, was incomprehensible in an era of enlightenment and of belief in natural compassion. Quote, who would have believed that there would be such cruelty, that it could come so suddenly? Does this not make us realize that this is not a matter of natural law or judgment? While Halberstam posed the question, he did not suggest an answer. Other thinkers did. Elchonin Wasserman, the head of Baranovich Poland Yeshiva, wrote that any attempt to understand the events surrounding Kristallnacht could drive one insane. But one could, indeed must, look to Torah. It would explain everything, and one should not remove one's finger from the text even for a moment. In the land of Israel, the chief rabbi of Perach Tikva, Reuven Katz, wrote that no rational explanation was possible as to how, in an era of culture, the greatest tyrant in Israel's history could arise, how in an age of socialism and democracy, decrees of obliteration could be issued, how racial madness could erupt in a world where nations and races were mixed. Quote, was this meaningless? Do not such hard facts make us think? Is the hand from above not hidden in all this? Katz concluded that redemption was imminent and that God had brought a Haman-like figure to induce Israel to return to its better self. Chief Rabbi of Tel Aviv, Moshe Avigdor Amiel, a religious nationalist, concluded that hatred towards Jews and the intent to annihilate them went beyond human understanding. One must ask, why did God do this? If man sees, it says in the Talmud, that powerful sufferings visit him, let him examine his own conduct. In Tel Aviv, also, Dvorkas, Waya Dvorkas, citing the current decline of civilization and the awakening of bestial-like inclinations, asked, who would have thought that the learned and cultured German people would turn overnight into an animal of prey, or that technological achievements could stand along with ethical collapse, that airplanes could be made into birds of prey? One had to look to higher providence, and it would become clear, as the rabbinic sages said, that trouble came to the world only on Israel's account. In America, Rabbi Mordechai Schwartz of Cleveland, a close associate of the great Rav Kook, iterated the Kristallnacht destruction of synagogues, the burning of Torah scrolls and rabbinic texts, forcing tens of thousands of Jews into homelessness and imprisonment in concentration camp, and then he asked, how could some Austrian painter and low-ranked soldier who was jailed in Germany for perverse activities dissolve the Reichstag, annul state law, dismiss judges and ministers, kill hundreds of army officers overnight, and take over the treasury, all in enlightened Germany? Such destruction could be traceable only to God. As the rabbinic sages said, knowest thou not that it is heaven that has ordained this Roman nation to reign? Thus, Orthodox rabbis across the globe concluded independently that comprehending such a level of viciousness was outside and beyond human nature and understanding. Once setting the boundary, given the belief in God's all-inclusive presence in the world, they opened a threshold and pointed to a higher transnatural area of knowledge, that of Torah, God's relationship to his people, and to divine oversight and governance. Second theme, explanation from above and its focus. The turn to divine oversight in God's relationship to the people of Israel, as disclosed by Torah, yielded a consensus, again arrived at independently across the globe. God's chosen people were at the center of world events, and the dominant actors. The Kristallnacht tragedy, accordingly, was caused by Jews. Their suffering had to do with Israel's relationship to God. The conclusion, the sins of assimilationist Jews caused the tragedy. Y.A. Dorcas, who I mentioned before, correlated the growth of anti-Semitism with assimilation. When Jews across the diaspora were being granted equal rights, the spiritual leaders pointed to the emergence of new anti-Semitism and sounded the alarm to return to Jewish sources. But the leaders were ignored in the mistaken belief that assimilation was the remedy. Then, when evil erupted, few Jews were ready for it. In Vilnius, the renowned Chaim Ozer Grzinski drew an historically causal connection. The plight of thousands of Jews who were stranded on the German-Polish border and threatened by death, he contended, was the long-term result of assimilationist reform in Western Europe. Grzinski called for penitent return with its ramifications for redemption. Schwartz in Cleveland and Amiel in Tel Aviv added to the causal connection the element of backfiring. Jews, Schwartz wrote, had hoped to integrate themselves, including moving into the professions, by violating the commandments of Torah, Sabbath, kosher food laws, family purity, study of Torah. Instead, Jewish property was taken, Jews were beaten and forced into concentration camps. True, there was a latent pathological hatred on the part of the nations for the people of Israel. But absent the wrong-headed attempt to co-opt animosity with intimacy, which served as a catalyst, the hatred would have remained dormant. It followed that the deeper the intrusion into German Gentile culture, the harsher the repulsion. According to Schwartz's meta-historical narrative, God was punishing the people so they would return to Torah. Amiel observed that German-born Reform Judaism, with its assimilationist character and incentives to convert to Christianity, did not bring about the equal rights as anticipated. Instead, it brought Hitler's racial doctrine and his determination to eliminate Jews in Judaism. Eliezer Gershon Friedenson in Lodz added the element of self-deception. Kristallnacht, he said, was a divine punishment for assimilation, particularly by Reformed Jews. Their immersion into Gentile German culture amounted to a, quote, wild devil dance of Jewish denial, end of quote, and the delusion that it would make them more secure. Elchonan Wasserman channeled the elements of correlation, historical causality, backfiring delusion into a dialectic about Amalek. In traditional Orthodox Jewish thought, Amalek, the paradigmatic enemy of ancient Israel, who was destroyed with his people, the Amalekites in the biblical era, had become transformed into a mythic, timeless category of absolute evil. The evil assumed various historical identities: Haman, Khmelnytsky, Petlura, and finally Hitler. Wasserman spoke of Amalek's becoming internalized within the Jewish people in the form of the Berlin Enlightenment, the loss of Torah overall, and the loss of Torah overall. Originally, Torah learning displaced chaos, and now the loss of Torah was replaced by Amalek within the Jewish people. But as the universe was ultimately enveloped by Torah, a process was immediately set in motion to destroy the internal Amalek. God intervened into history and used Hitler to punish Israel back to its Torah self. Punishment that followed was measure for measure, both in type and in severity. For example, Nazi National Socialism reacted measure to Jewish nationalism and socialism. The closing of Jewish theaters was a response to Jews turning to theatrical entertainment to the neglect of Torah study. The motives behind blaming other Jews was not clear. Did these thinkers believe that if responsibility could be found, steps could be taken to ameliorate the situation? Were they internalizing the outside contempt for the Jewish people? Did they presume they had the ability to probe God's mind? Was blame of fellow Jews the only alternative to surrendering to the belief that God oversaw history? The sources don't say. What is clear is that by identifying the cause of cause as Jewish, Orthodox thinkers strengthened their belief that the chosen people of God generated world events and ultimately controlled them. 3, anticipating apocalypse and redemption. The grounding in meta-history, with its focus on blame, however, did not bring closure to our thinkers. Perhaps because the agony continued. Perhaps because the ambiguities distressed them. For example, how did they know that suffering evoked a return to Torah self? That the transcendent God reacted to human action? That while assimilants were responsible, most of them who suffered were not? When they did probe further, they set any such quandaries aside and arrived at apocalyptic visions of God. And then they spoke of the outcome of the battle, redemption, which would ultimately relieve the pains. Thus, in large, Friedenson described Kristallnacht as a volcanic-like eruption of a barbaric primitive evil, one which had swallowed Germany's culture, science, and art. Redemption was imminent, and this meant that the realm of evil was about to be extinguished. Amalek's head of death, Friedenson wrote, rose out of its grave to see the light of the world one more time. Amalek mocked and spat at the majestic image of God. He convulsed in death throes of insanity, robbery, and sadism, knowing he was about to lose his battle with the light of God. In Chicago, in December, Shmuel Pardes spoke of a great Shoah, starvation, torture, and to death, the insanity and suicide, the destruction of synagogues, and burning of Torah scrolls. 12,000 Polish Jews were expelled from Germany in the darkness of night, and many were still on the German-Polish border, naked and without anything, and concluded, quote, "The evil Hitler vilifies and blasphemes the God of Israel and decrees that God's name be erased from the Tanakh, the Bible. We believe that, quote, Hitler's war with God will bring his fall near." The head of the Merkaz Harav Kook Yeshiva in Jerusalem, Yaakov Moshe Charlap, a Kabbalist, a mystic, shared Friedenson's apocalyptic vision. The perpetrators were incarnations of the realm of negative beings, Sitra Achra. Recognizing that redemption was coming and that death was imminent, the Sitra Achra sought to destroy Israel, for Israel channeled redemption into the universe. While the cosmic battle between good, God, the people of Israel, and sanctity, and evil, Amalek, Sitra Achra, unfolded above, they said the people of Israel had to act below. It appears that there was an inner point of identity between the heteronymous and autonomous dimensions, which manifests itself as a dialectical interchange between the inevitable on high and the voluntary below. Elchanan Wasserman's passivity were exceptions. Wasserman identified the events surrounding Kristallnacht as those of the onset of the Messiah. As if possessing foreknowledge of the Holocaust and the fall of 1938, he predicted homelessness of Jews across the world, with not a single Jew remaining in his or her original place, expulsion everywhere and admission nowhere, extreme hunger, poverty, and unemployment. As Jews had abandoned Torah, they were left without faith, unable to comprehend their suffering, dependent, and they were suicidal. There was nothing they could do other than wait out the troubles until God would decide that they had been punished enough and would bring redemption. Others called for action, benevolence, Torah study, penitent return, restoring the land of Israel, and Levitical prayer. In the interest of time, I'll point only to two of these. The Admor of Bobov, the head of this great Hasidic movement of some 120,000, depicted the meta-history of the people in Israel as one of descents and ascents, proportional to one another. In the current era, that of the onset of the Messiah, the descent would be deepest. It would be followed by an ascent so dramatic as to break out of the proportional descent-ascent pattern and into redemption. Salvation would come suddenly and from above. As this was the era of the onset of the Messiah, we need to make the greatest effort at benevolence, Gemilut Chasadim, one of the pillars of the world. Friedenson spoke of Torah study. Well, I'll take one from Petah Tikva and one from Brooklyn. In Petach Tikva, Reuven Katz identified the world's descent into a flood of fire and the bestial behavior as the sufferings before the Messiah, which heralded redemption. He cited the rabbinic sages that if Israel was not worthy of redemption, God would set a king as cruel as Haman over Israel to bring penitent return, voluntary or in the form of suffering. Katz called upon Jews to build and restore the nation of Israel in the land of Israel on the foundation of Torah and Judaism. Finally, in Brooklyn, New York, Menachem Rizikov, a religious nationalist, called for those belonging to the priestly class, the tribe of Levites, to convene for a day of penitent return and create a bridge between disaster and salvation itself. He quoted, "The Messiah will come in the course of time, while it is also written, I will hasten it, God will hasten it. Otherwise, the Messiah will come at the end of time." According to the rabbinic sages, he explained, world history would yield to redemption in the year 6000, according to the Hebrew calendar. Beginning 300 years before the temporal path to redemption, that it would start. The final 9 months would be of intense suffering, and this, he said, was the current flood of fire in 1937 and 1938. Hitler, he said, had no reason to expel Jews from Germany, leaving them naked, hungry, and drawn to suicide. He did so because he was absolute evil, and he was compelled to destroy purity even if it killed them. He was the current Amalek, evil for the sake of being evil. Hitler would take out the eye of Israel even if it meant losing 2 of his own. Following the summer months, month of Av, time would be accelerated, he said, by God. Nazism would collapse, redemption would begin. Then he recalled, when the Second Temple was set aflame in 70 AD, young priests ascended to the roof and handed the keys to heaven. By convening now during the month of Av, during the summer, August then, for a day of mourning and atonement, attired in white robes, wrapped in tefillin, those are phylacteries, and imploring God in prayer for redemption, the keys to the temple would be returned to history, blending history and redemption. And so, to sum up and conclude, the devastating encounter of Kristallnacht included the response of Orthodox Jews on the level of thought on an international and global level. It was initially rational, but only to the point of reasoning that reason could not offer understanding. Their thinking moved from the self-critical line of comprehension to the area of myth, transforming the empirically rational data. Next, in the meta-historical narrative, the data was sublated into a reflection of higher reality, whereby assimilationist Jews had set off a dynamic where divine punishment for abandoning Torah was implemented by Nazism. And then, third theme, whether because of the many ambiguities or a sense of hopelessness in the face of the horrors of Kristallnacht, Orthodox thinkers moved collectively to an even higher plane, where a cosmic battle was underway between God and Hitler as the incarnation of the realm of negative being, the Sitra Achra. The battle was that of the onset of the Messiah, the onset of metaphysical redemption. All Jews were expected to share in the process from their position below, which was indispensable to an inevitable development on high and the onset of messianic redemption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very eye-opening and fascinating. I'm just going to make one very quick question and then open the floor. What struck me is that you're ranging across very diverse communities in the Orthodox Jewish world and seeing a lot of harmony or at least overlap in their perspectives. And I'm wondering, and I think from where we're coming from, this is quite striking, just the terms that they're viewing the Nazis in. And I'm wondering, is there a moment where things start to change, where things start to break apart and the Holocaust or the events on the road to the Holocaust are no longer cast in this kind of meta-historical narrative where there's dissent in the ranks of these different communities? If you could speak about that briefly, and maybe I'll also collect a few questions now. François Quinet.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure, was there any Sephardi authority you cited, or were these exclusively Ashkenazi authorities? Question one. Question two. One could have the impression that they were reaping the windfall of the catastrophe by admonishing their flock to repent and return to the Torah, etc., which is not very surprising. What I found interesting is the attempt of the Bobova Rebbe to use a very specific tool, namely to mass produce publication or to mass distribute a publication. So is this something which was repeated in other contexts? So do they use also more contemporary means of reaching out to a broader audience in this context? Thank you.
Just pass the microphone down to your side.
Allow me to translate it or transform it to someone else, because it sounds very strange, okay? But how about Viktor Frankl? I don't know. Trying to act ethical and find meaning in life and see all the atrocity around is also crazy. I would say that in a way, that both camps are doing the same thing and trying to be authentic and loyal to ethical beliefs and a connection to a spiritual God, a higher God, or the Torah. They might be doing it in different ways, but they're speaking the same language. And I guess that's the secret of our survival, maybe? You have to be a little meshuggah?
Okay. As I began to research and gather these materials, it was quite striking that what was being said in Cleveland, Ohio, was the same thing as what was being said in Tel Aviv and in Bobov. And what it is that there's a common literature which binds the Orthodox Jewish community around the world. And it's quite stunning. These people were in communication with each other by letters and by publications, but still, this was a crisis point. And while I found some exceptions to this, for example, Wasserman said, there simply is nothing we can do. We just have to wait until the horror passes, and then there will be redemption. In the meantime, what you have to do is study the Torah, because that will keep us alive through the event. But the others said, look, we have to do Torah, we have to be benevolent, and so forth. As far as this cohesion remaining throughout, well, this is just about 1939. There's no difference. 1941, 1943, 1947, the only change, general change that takes place. Now, mind you, I have materials from Bratislava and from Budapest and from the ghetto in Warsaw. And I tell you, it all is part of this general framework. The one change is like this, and it was already implied in what I said. These people think meta-historically, whereby they sublate empirical data into this mythic reality. Now, once they do that, everything has to fit. That probably accounts for one of the reasons why they blame the Reform Jews. Look, God is still in charge of history. So if something troublesome happens, it's our fault. But wait a minute, it's not our fault, it's their fault. So you have to interpret it in terms of this meta-history where God and the people of Israel are together. And that leads them to this thought, which is quite striking, that Adolf Hitler was an instrument of God. It simply follows. They are in control of history. They're not going to give up the covenantal relationship to history. And this continues. But the last part of my paper then passed into something else. Apparently, at certain points among these people, and then in 1944 or 1945, it's like this whole structure explodes. And it's no longer a meta-historical situation where God controls history, you see, and where Hitler is an instrument of God, and that they're talking about the assimilations of being to blame. They're talking apocalyptic. You come to those statements made in 46 and 47, and what we're talking about is people saying the world has been destroyed, history has gone into oblivion, and now we're facing an ontological battle between chaos and God. And chaos is going to be destroyed. The Nazis are doing the death dance right before they sink into oblivion with all of history. So that's the one change, this process from meta-history to apocalyptic. Okay? Next, about the Sephardi, I wish I came across one document written in Jerba at this time, but other than that, until now we don't have, but I began discovering things a couple of decades ago, and I tell you, every time I teach a course at Hebrew University on the subject, I'm bringing in new materials because we're dealing with new materials all the same. Now, you came up with this idea, reaping the windfall and calling in the flock. And I think that that's true. The only question is, was that all there was to it? And I don't know. And I suggested other things, that they were internalizing the hatred. You know, the world hates us, but it's not us. You know, it's them, you see? Or that if we can affix blame, we love these reform, we love these assimilations, and we're going to bring them back to us. You see, if you can identify what's happening, you could bring them back. So there's probably some of that in there, but I don't think that that's the end of the story. About the communications, Bobov did, from what we know, distribute these pamphlets, but otherwise the materials we have are in documents and printed, are in manuscript materials and in newspapers. By the way, there's a tremendous amount of material of Orthodox Jews here in America responding to the events of Hitler's rise to power and in 1938 and all that. But they were nothing massive, like that was, from what we know, unusual. But you should also understand, someone like Halberstam, who was the Admor, which means the head of the whole Hasidic sect, when he said something, it went out. And by the way, a lot of these Hasidim didn't live in Bobov near him, and so there had to be this was so with most of the Hasidic things. You could see that in that wonderful book by Marcin Rodzinski right now on mapping Hasidism. As far as the last comment, who are you calling Meshuggah? Yeah.
Where's the microphone?
So thank you so much for your paper. When I was reading it, it was something so foreign to my own experiences that I had to try to think comparatively and try to relate it to something. And then I started saying, well, this reminds me so much of how sometimes the evangelical Christians that I came to know in Oklahoma related to things. And that, again, was something beyond my own way of thinking about things, or how I think of, would think of myself sometimes as a religious person, but it was something, again, very different from my own experiences. And to have one of my students at Oklahoma State, confront me with, when I was trying to talk about global warming, but she said, but there's nothing to worry about. It's all part of God's plan. It's the unfolding, it's the opening up the rapture. Why are you concerned about this? Maybe it's happening, maybe it's not, but it's all in God's hands. So I phrased it more as an observation, and how I could try to relate to what you're talking about. But also, maybe the question comes around to, is there a broader human phenomenon that we're looking at here which stretches beyond Orthodox Judaism to a broader human way of trying to deal with immense tragedy, things that are so big, so overwhelming that we don't know what else to do.
And then let's get the microphone over here for Jason.
Thanks. Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I want to pose two very brief questions because I think what you're describing here is particularly striking because it is kind of a global phenomenon that you're picking out people from all over the place. Admittedly mostly Ashkenazi, who are basically saying the same thing. But what strikes me as well is that this is not a new thing necessarily. That when you think about this kind of a theological meta-narrative of response to tragedy, that Orthodox and otherwise traditional Jews, say, at least 3 times a day, right? That because of our sins we were, expelled or cast out of our land. And so, this is sort of what I'm curious about here to some extent. Then is, how is this a surprising, response, right? Isn't this in a certain way just the traditional response to tragedy that we could see kind of throughout Jewish history, or at least throughout Rabbinic Judaism of talking about various tragedies that befell the Jews. So that's the first thing, and the second thing is. To what extent, I'm not sure how much you've studied this or not, does this view continue? Right. So, for instance, if you look at more recent writing about the Holocaust or about Kristallnacht in particular, within Orthodox circles, for instance, publications connected to Art Scroll, right, or even some of the ultra-Orthodox groups, the Haredi groups, Hasidic groups of various types. Are they still saying the same thing, in their various internal publications, histories, and so on and so forth?
In the back, Jean.
Thank you for the presentation. It's fascinating. You know how interested I am in this topic. What about Zionism? I think post-war. It was one of the response, as far as little as I know, to explain the Holocaust in some circles, ultra-Orthodox circles. That's Jews wanted to overcome, to decide for God, the creation of the Jewish state. That was a part of it still is, in some small circle. Did you find that already? And second, I have, myself, I published a document. I will let you know about it. It's a bit further than 1938. It's 1340. It's a French Orthodox Jew who has exactly the same kind of reflection. It's quite unique among French Jews. But he widened that a bit. Leon
Ashkenazi. Manitou, you're talking about.
So the one I'm referring is a French Jew who is Orthodox, writing in his diary, reflecting exactly on the same lines, as you described. But he has something a bit more. It goes a bit beyond that. He said, of course, the responsibility of the catastrophe is because Jews lost their faith and the tradition. But he goes a bit beyond that. He said, but not only the Jews, also the Christian world. The non-Jews lost the spiritual tradition. I don't know if you have come across that. It's very interesting.
Okay. One, I got to tell you, what I have to say doesn't have much currency in America. That's one of the reasons I'm teaching at the Hebrew University, because because modernist universalists. But I have a lot of currency among the evangelicals. You should hear the response to me at the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary out there in Berrien Springs. But you're perfectly correct. You are perfectly correct. They are operating in meta-historical terms. What is utterly incredible among the evangelicals is this, that the literalist tradition among them, which we thought was being eclipsed by people like Harry Emerson Fosdick, that has gone into the shadows while the literalist tradition and this meta-historical and mythic has exploded. And that's what we have, 40 million evangelical Christians in America. So it is definitely there. And going back to what you were saying, look, myth provides life for these people and a continuity. What I said in the beginning really is true. Reform and conservative Jews, thinkers who do not have the meta-historical dimension, who do not have the mythic dimensions, were able to respond, could not respond at all during the Holocaust, during the entire event. Reconstructionists, Kaplan wrote not one line about it. And that also explains what I would call the bankruptcy in the theology of Reform and Conservative Judaism in America. They have no means to survive. Two, is it new? Well, it turns out that most of the people that I deal with say this is unprecedented, okay? Then what they do is they go back to the revealed sources. So what they do have in common, they have the same language, and what they have in common is a statement that this never happened before and we have to deal with it in a new way. And that is how it goes. And ultimately, what you can also say that what is new about this is that there was no Holocaust before. And that's what's unprecedented. And that they were able then to draw on their traditional sources, you see. Yes, that's where you come in and say you've heard things about this in the past. Next, well, about the Zionism and the Holocaust, that's a tremendous topic, of course. About 1938, we did have Reuven Katz saying what he did, that the way to respond to this apocalyptic battle was to build the land of Israel. That was in 1938. And then you have Amiel. Now, Amiel came from Antwerp to become the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And he said the following, look, you have two peoples in the world, or metaphysical entities. You got your Jews, they're of Torah, and then you have everybody else. Everybody else, they hate the Jews. Ever since Esau, look at Rome, go right before his, they hate us, it's latent. As Bob Wister says, anti-Semitism is a lethal, ongoing phenomenon. It's simply there, okay? Am I being stopped by somebody here? No, okay. So he said, what do you do? What do you do, Amiel said, if these two people, if they hate us? If they hate, his answer, don't go near them. And he said what was happening was that the Reform and Assimilationist Jews were going near them. So they set off this explosion. There's only one thing to do. Get away from them. We got to be isolated. We have to go to our own land. And that way, we won't deal with them and they can have their latent hatred, but they won't touch us. So about Christianity, I forget where, was it, who asked about whether Christians were, you were also asked that, okay. Well, at this point, they're not talking about Christians, but let me cite one person who wrote something in 1943 who did refer to Christians, and that is the Abraham Heschel, the Rabbi Abraham Heschel, okay? And he wrote something in a Jewish paper, which it came out in London, all right? And the Jewish Weekly, Wochenzeitung. And he said, what is happening now is that the entire world has lost its sanctity, its Christianity, and its Judaism, and it's everyone. And when the world loses its sanctity, God withdraws from the world. When we return to the sacred and we become holy again, including the Christians, then the eclipse of God would end and we would see the return of the sacred. And there, Avraham Heschel did speak of Christianity. But there, I just want to thank you very much. Wolf, thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity. And I really appreciated that you came back and asked me some questions. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for giving us this fascinating presentation. And I'll give the microphone to Wolf.
So thank you so much for all the panelists. And I also wanted to give a warm hand to Paul. And I have to say I undersold him a little bit because I forgot to mention that he is also the director of the Max Kade Institute for German, Austrian, and Swiss Studies, which revived now a little bit the German studies here at USC. So thank you so much, Paul. So now it's just the time to say thank you all for staying the whole day. We resume tomorrow at around 10 at a very different place, which is the Villa Aurora, the home of the German Jewish writer who was in exile here in Los Angeles, Leon Feuchtwanger. So this is not only a very special place, which you will discover, but it's also has a lot of meaning because there's a very close relationship between USC and the Villa Aurora. So I hope I see you all there. All the participants will be there, I know that. So thank you all, have a good night. And do I have any housekeeping, any other housekeeping things? Oh yeah, so the participants, there will be a van from the hotel. Those who come on their own, please, there's no parking uphill. So please try to use Lyft or public transport. Just I warn you, this is a very windy road. There are no parking spots at all. Anything else? I forgot. Now I know. For those who are still kind of have a lot of energy or even a little bit of energy, I wanted to remind you that just one floor down, there is this small exhibition which I mentioned in the beginning yesterday, which is open to all of you with the collection of the American Jew who liberated Germany with the artifacts of the swastika and other letters. And so maybe you have just a small glimpse into this collection. I think it's worth it. Then I wanted to say that tomorrow we will have, after the two panels, concluding discussions, and for the participants, the speakers and the chairs who come, I wanted to say maybe when you rest today after the 2 long days and you have a minute, think about what kind of questions come up in your mind after these 2 days, which we can kind of discuss a little bit and explore a little bit more in depth when we have an hour of kind of a concluding discussion. Yep, thanks a lot.